The divorce papers trembled in Sarah's hands as she stood alone in the empty courtroom hallway. Her other hand, instinctively protecting her still flat stomach, were two tiny hearts. Beat in perfect rhythm, a secret she'd planned to share with Marcus that very evening, along with the lottery ticket hidden in her purse that had just changed their lives forever. But now he was gone, walking away with Jessica, the woman he'd chosen over their 7 years of marriage. Sarah Mitchell had always been the kind of woman who found beauty in simple moments: morning coffee, shared in comfortable silence, handwritten notes tucked into lunchboxes, and the way Marcus used to trace patterns on her palm while they watched old movies on their worn leather couch. But somewhere along the way, those moments had faded like photographs left too long in sunlight, and Marcus had grown distant, his eyes no longer lighting up when she entered a room, his kisses becoming perfunctory pecks on the cheek rather than the lingering embraces that once made her feel like she was home. The morning everything changed had started like any other gray Tuesday in November, with Sarah stopping at the corner store on Maple Street, where Mr. Chen had sold newspapers and lottery tickets for 30 years, his weathered hands counting out her change as she bought her weekly ticket with the same numbers she'd played since college: her parents' anniversary date, her grandmother's birthday, and the number of the hospital room where she'd first met Marcus after his motorcycle accident 8 years ago, when she was a young nurse and he was a patient with a broken leg and the most beautiful smile she'd ever seen. "You're glowing today, Sarah," Mr. Chen had said with his knowing smile, unaware that she'd just come from Dr. Morrison's office, where she'd received the shock of her life. Not one, but two heartbeats flickering on the ultrasound screen. Twins conceived during what she'd thought was a reconciliation weekend at the cabin, before Marcus had grown cold again, before the late nights at the office became more frequent, before she'd found the receipt for a jewelry store purchase that had never made its way to her. That evening, as she'd prepared Marcus's favorite dinner, rosemary chicken with roasted vegetables, the meal she'd cooked on their first date, she'd rehearsed the words in her mind, imagining how his face would transform when she told him about the babies. How maybe, just maybe, this miracle would bridge the growing chasm between them. But Marcus had walked through the door with an expression she'd never seen before, a mixture of guilt and determination that made her stomach drop even before he spoke, the words that shattered her carefully planned announcement. "Sarah, we need to talk," he'd said, not even noticing the candles she'd lit or the way she'd styled her hair, the way he used to love. And as he sat across from her at their dining table, the one they'd refinished together during their first year of marriage, laughing as they got paint in each other's hair, he'd told her about Jessica, the marketing executive from his firm, younger and more ambitious, someone who understood his dreams and pushed him to be better. Words that cut deeper than any blade, because Sarah had spent 7 years supporting every dream he'd ever voiced, from his failed restaurant venture to his current corporate ambitions, never once complaining when money was tight or when his dreams seemed to overshadow their life together. "I've already filed the papers," Marcus had said, sliding the envelope across the table, his wedding ring already absent from his finger. A pale line of skin, the only evidence it had ever been there. "Jessica and I, we're getting married as soon as the divorce is finalized, and I think it's best if we make this quick and clean. You can keep the house, I'll take my retirement savings, and we can both move on with our lives." The words she'd wanted to say about the twins, about the love she still felt despite everything, about the lottery ticket she'd bought that morning which she'd planned to check together as they always did on Tuesday. Nights all died in her throat as she watched the man she'd pledged forever to describe their dissolution with the same detached efficiency he used for quarterly business reports. And so she'd simply nodded, sighed where he pointed, and watched him walk out with a small suitcase he'd already packed, heading to Jessica's apartment on the other side of town where his new life was waiting. It wasn't until 3 hours later, sitting alone in their house, her house now surrounded by photos of happier times, that she'd remembered the lottery ticket, pulling it from her purse with numb fingers and checking the numbers on her phone more out of habit than hope. and then checking them again, and again, and again. Because surely she was seeing wrong. Surely the universe wasn't this cruel or this generous. Surely the numbers on her screen didn't match every single one on her ticket, declaring her the sole winner of a $700 million jackpot. The next morning, Sarah had sat in the office of Patricia Winters, the Lottery Commission's financial advisor, a kind woman with silver hair who'd seen enough winners to know that Sarah's tears weren't from joy, but from a deeper, more complex emotion that money could never quite solve. And as Patricia explained trusts and annuities and tax implications, Sarah's hand had unconsciously moved to her stomach, where her secret grew quietly. Two tiny souls who would never know a father who'd walked away before learning of their existence. "I want to remain anonymous," Sarah had said firmly, her voice stronger than she'd felt, completely anonymous, and Patricia had nodded, understanding without explanation that sometimes fortune arrives at the precise moment when sharing it with the world would only compound the heartbreak. And so they'd arranged everything quietly, the trust, the financial management, the careful steps that would allow Sarah to rebuild her life without fanfare or attention. Over the following weeks, as her divorce proceeded with what Marcus proudly called unprecedented efficiency, Sarah had quietly purchased the old Riverside Children's Center that had been shuttered for 2 years due to lack of funding, hiring contractors to transform it into a state-of-the-art facility for underprivileged kids, a place where single mothers could find support and children could discover their dreams, all funded by an anonymous benefactor that the local news couldn't stop talking about. She'd kept her morning routine at the coffee shop where she'd always gone, still ordering a medium latte and blueberry scone, still chatting with Maria the barista about the weather and weekend plans, still wearing her old clothes and driving her 10-year-old Honda, because Sarah understood that money hadn't changed who she was at her core. It had simply given her the power to become who she'd always wanted to be. The day her divorce was finalized was the same day she had her 20-week ultrasound, where Dr. Morrison confirmed that both babies were healthy and revealed their genders. 2 boys who were already showing distinct personalities, one always active while the other seemed content to float peacefully, and Sarah had cried then, not from sadness, but from a fierce protective love that surprised her with its intensity. A love that made Marcus's absence feel less like a loss and more like a clearing of space for something better. She'd seen Marcus only once during the divorce proceedings, in the courthouse parking lot where he'd been walking with Jessica, her arm linked through his as she laughed at something on her phone. Her engagement ring, the one from the receipt Sarah had found, catching the light like a tiny star, and Sarah had felt not jealousy, but a strange sort of pity, because Marcus looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, as Jessica pulled him along to their next appointment, their next plan, their next step in a life that seemed to be moving too fast for him to catch his breath. 3 months after the divorce, the Riverside Children's Center held its grand opening, a celebration that drew hundreds from the community, including Marcus and Jessica, who attended because Jessica's firm had been hired to handle the marketing for what everyone called the Miracle on Riverside, and Sarah had watched from the back of the crowd as Marcus toured the facility, his eyes widening at the computer lab, the music room, the library filled with thousands of books, the counseling center where single parents could receive free support, his expression growing more puzzled as he noticed small details, the reading nook designed exactly as Sarah had always described her dream classroom when she'd talked about leaving nursing for teaching, the garden with raised beds perfect for small hands to learn about growth and patience, the art studio with north-facing windows that caught the light, just as she'd always said an art room should, this anonymous benefactor. Marcus had said to the director, unaware that Sarah stood just 20 feet away, her pregnancy now showing, despite the loose dress she wore. "They must be extraordinary," and the director, Mrs. Foster, had smiled and replied, "They are, but not in the way you'd think. They insisted that this place focused not on charity, but on dignity, on giving people the tools to build their own dreams rather than simply accepting help, and they specifically wanted programs for women starting over, for children who'd lost a parent, for families that just needed someone to believe in them when the world had stopped. Sarah had slipped away before he could turn and see her, but not before she heard Jessica complaining about the event running long, about missing their dinner reservation, about how these charity things were important for Marcus's career, but honestly, quite boring. And she'd seen Marcus's shoulders tense the way they used to when he felt trapped between obligation and desire. A tension Sarah knew all too well from their final years together. The twins arrived on a storm-lashed Tuesday in March. Two perfect boys, she named Thomas and Timothy names. She'd chosen alone in the quiet of her hospital room while rain drummed against the windows and her mother held her hand. The only person besides her medical team who knew the full truth of her situation. And as Sarah held her sons for the first time, their tiny fingers wrapping around hers with surprising strength, she'd whispered promises to them about the life they would have, filled with love and possibility, and the kind of steady, unconditional presence their father had been unable to provide. It was 6 months later, at the coffee shop on a Thursday morning, that fate decided to complete its circle, when Marcus walked in looking like a shadow of his former self, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it, his eyes red-rimmed and lost, and Sarah, sitting in the corner booth feeding Thomas while Timothy slept in his carrier, felt her heart constrict, not with love, but with the complicated compassion you feel for someone who once meant everything, but had chosen to mean nothing. He ordered black coffee strange, because he'd always taken it with 2 sugars and cream, and sat at the counter with his head in his hands, not noticing Sarah until Thomas made a delighted gurgling sound that drew his attention, and their eyes met across the small space, his widening with shock at the sight of the babies, at the sight of her looking radiant in a way he'd never seen, at the realization written clearly across his face of what he'd walked away from without knowing. "Sarah," he'd said, approaching slowly, as if she might disappear, his eyes moving from her face to the twins, and back again, the math clearly spinning in his mind, the timeline that told him everything he needed to know about what he'd left behind. "These are they?" And Sarah had simply nodded, adjusting Thomas's bottle, while Timothy began to stir, her silence saying more than any words could have. "I didn't know," Marcus whispered, sinking into the seat across from her without invitation, his hands shaking as he reached toward. Timothy then pulled back, understanding he had no right to touch what he'd abandoned. "God, Sarah, why didn't you tell me?" And she'd looked at him then with eyes that held no anger, only a sad understanding, as she replied, "You were walking out the door to start your new life with Jessica. Marcus, you'd already filed the papers, already moved on, already decided our marriage was a mistake you needed to correct. So what would you have had me do? Trap you with babies you didn't want from a wife you couldn't love anymore?" The truth of it hung between them like a living thing while outside the coffee shop. Life continued, people rushing to work, children laughing on their way to school, the world spinning on as it always did, regardless of personal catastrophes, and Marcus had broken down then, tears falling freely as he told her about Jessica leaving him 2 weeks ago for a senior partner at the firm, about how empty his apartment felt, how hollow his victories at work seemed, how he'd driven past their old house, her house, dozens of times, wanting to knock, but knowing he'd forfeited that right. And Sarah had listened without judgment, feeding her boys, while the man who'd fathered them fell apart in front of her. "The children's center," he said suddenly, the realization dawning on his face like sunrise after a long night. "The anonymous benefactor, the details were all you, weren't they? The reading nook, the garden, the art studio, ... Sarah, how?" And she'd smiled then, a soft smile that held secrets she would never share, simply saying, "Sometimes life gives us what we need exactly when we need it, Marcus." and what I needed was the ability to help others start over, to build something beautiful from broken pieces, to show my sons that strength isn't about having everything, but about sharing whatever you have. She'd stood then, gathering her boys with the practiced efficiency of a mother who'd learned to navigate the world alone, and Marcus had stood too, his hand reaching out, but not quite touching her arm as he asked, "Can I? Could I maybe see them sometime? Not as their father, No, I gave up that right, but just, could I know them?" And Sarah had looked at her boys, at Thomas with his father's nose, and Timothy with his father's stubborn chin, and made a decision that would define the kind of mother she would be, the kind of person money hadn't changed her from being. "The Children's Center has a reading program on Saturday mornings," she'd said quietly. "Volunteers come to read to the kids, to show them that books can take you anywhere, that stories matter, that someone cares enough to share that time with them. Timothy and Thomas will be there with me while I coordinate the program, and volunteers are always welcome." And she'd seen the hope bloom in his eyes, even as she added, "But Marcus, understand this, you'll be Mr. Marcus to them, a kind man who reads stories, nothing more, unless and until you prove you can be consistent, that you can show up not just when you're lonely or sorry, but every single Saturday, rain or shine, whether you feel like it or not, because that's what children need, consistency, reliability. Someone who chooses them over and over again, even when it's inconvenient." Marcus had nodded, understanding the test and the gift wrapped within it, and true to his word. He'd shown up that Saturday, and every Saturday since, sitting in the story circle, reading about dragons and princesses, and brave little trains that could, watching from a respectful distance as his sons grew from babies to crawling adventurers to toddling explorers. Never pushing for more than Sarah offered, never mentioning the past, except to say thank you for the chance to be even a small part of their world. It was a full year later, on the twins' second birthday, that Sarah finally told him the whole truth, sitting in the garden of the Children's Center while Thomas and Timothy played on the new playground equipment, their laughter mixing with that of dozens of other children whose lives had been changed by one woman's broken heart transformed into purpose. And Marcus had sat in stunned silence as she explained about the lottery ticket, about the $700 million that had arrived at the exact moment he'd walked away, about the choice she'd made to use it for healing rather than revenge, for building rather than destroying, for showing their sons that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched and the love you shared. "You could have destroyed me," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "One word to Jessica about the money, one hint to my colleagues, one moment of revealing what I'd walked away from, and my life would have imploded." But Sarah had shaken her head, watching their boys help a smaller child onto the swing, already showing the kindness she'd tried so hard to instill in them, and replied, "Destroying you would have destroyed part of them. Marcus, they carry your DNA, your history, your potential for both greatness and failure, and I wanted them to see that people can make terrible mistakes and still contribute something good to the world, that redemption is possible if you're willing to work for it, that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, but about choosing to build something better from the ashes of what was." As the sun set over the Children's Center that day, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, that reminded Sarah of the sunset she and Marcus had watched on their honeymoon, she'd made one final revelation. "The center needs a permanent literacy director," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "Someone to expand the reading program, to build partnerships with schools, to show kids that education is the ladder out of whatever hole they're in. The position comes with a modest salary, nothing like what you made at the firm, but enough to live on. And more importantly, it comes with the chance to be part of something that matters, to be someone Thomas and Timothy can be proud of, not because you're their father but because you're a man who chose service over success, who chose meaning over money." And Marcus had accepted without hesitation, understanding that this was not reconciliation but something else, a new kind of family built not on romantic love, but on shared purpose, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the best parents are the ones who learn to parent themselves first. 5 years have passed since that divorce filing, and the Riverside Children's Center has become a beacon in the community, with Marcus running literacy programs that have helped hundreds of children discover the magic of reading, with Sarah quietly funding expansion after expansion while maintaining her anonymous status, with Thomas and Timothy growing into confident, compassionate boys who know Mr. Marcus as the man who reads the best dragon voices and who always has time to help them with their homework, who've started to notice how his eyes look just like theirs, who've begun asking questions that Sarah answers with gentle honesty, explaining that families come in all shapes and sizes and that love isn't always what we expect it to be. Jessica occasionally appears in the society pages, married now to the senior partner, living the life she'd always wanted, filled with galas and European vacations and the kind of glossy perfection that photographs well but feels hollow at 3 in the morning. And Marcus has shared with Sarah how he sometimes sees those photos and feels not regret but relief, understanding now that Jessica had loved the idea of him more than the reality, had pushed him to be someone he was never meant to be, had seen ambition where Sarah had seen soul. The lottery money, managed wisely and growing steadily, has funded not just the Children's Center but scholarships, medical clinics, food banks, and housing programs, all operating under different anonymous benefactors, but all connected by Sarah's vision of a world where a sudden windfall becomes not a palace for one, but a foundation for many, where $700 million transforms not one life, but thousands, where 2 boys grow up understanding that privilege is responsibility and wealth is worthless unless it's shared. On quiet evenings, when the boys are asleep and the center is closed and the world feels still, Sarah sometimes sits in the garden she designed to mirror, the one she'd dreamed of having at the house she'd shared with Marcus, and she thinks about the strange mathematics of loss and gain, how losing a husband had led to finding herself, how Marcus walking away had cleared the path for her to walk forward, how the universe had perhaps known what it was doing when it delivered fortune and heartbreak in the same week, forcing her to choose between bitterness and beauty, between revenge and renewal, between holding on to what was and reaching for what could be. Marcus, for his part, has never asked for more than Sarah has offered, understanding that trust once broken is not easily repaired, that father is a title earned through presence, not biology, that the miracle isn't that Sarah forgave him, but that she found a way to transform his abandonment into an opportunity for him to become the man he should have been all along. And sometimes, when he reads to the children at the center, when Thomas and Timothy climb into his lap for better views of the pictures, when Sarah smiles that soft smile that says he's doing well, he understands that success isn't about what you achieve, but about what you contribute. That wealth isn't about what you have, but about what you give. That family isn't about legal documents, but about showing up. Day after day, story after story, Saturday after Saturday, until the showing up becomes its own kind of love. The truth about the lottery remains known only to Sarah's mother, her financial advisor, and Marcus, a secret that protects not just Sarah, but the work itself, allowing the center to operate without the weight of obligation or expectation that would come with a known benefactor, letting the community own the miracle rather than owing it to someone. And Sarah has found peace in this anonymity, in being able to shop at the same stores and eat at the same restaurants and live in the same modest house without the burden of $700 million changing how people see her, because she learned the hard way that being seen for who you truly are is worth more than all the money in the world. As Thomas and Timothy grow older, they'll learn the truth in pieces about the father who left and returned humbled, about the fortune that arrived like a cosmic joke, about the choice their mother made to transform personal pain into public good, and they'll understand that their story isn't a fairy tale but something better, A real-life lesson in how grace can grow from heartbreak, how purpose can bloom from pain, how sometimes the best revenge against someone who didn't value you is to become invaluable to everyone else, to build something so beautiful that it makes the ugliness of betrayal seem like a necessary step toward something greater. The story of Sarah and Marcus and the $700 million isn't really about money at all. It's about the moment when you realize that the person who broke you accidentally freed you, that the fortune you receive is only as valuable as the good you do with it, that children need examples more than explanations, that forgiveness is not a gift you give to others, but a gift you give to yourself, that sometimes the universe conspires to give you exactly what you need, disguised as everything you didn't want, and that true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the lives you touch, the children you raise, the community you build, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you took the worst day of your life and transformed it into the beginning of thousands of better days for people you'll never meet. And as Sarah watches her boys play in the garden of the center their father's abandonment helped create, she knows that every signature on those divorce papers was really the universe's way of signing a different kind of contract, one that traded a broken marriage for a purpose, a husband for a mission, a life she'd planned for a life that planned itself, teaching her and everyone touched by her story that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover that you already have more than enough, that love multiplies when divided among many, that the best families are the ones that extend beyond blood to encompass everyone who needs a place to belong, and that $700 million is nothing compared to the value of two small boys learning that kindness is strength, that service is success, and that the richest person in any room is the one who gives the most away.